The massive Hell's Angel's thumb was hovering millimeters above the ignition switch. He was exactly 1 second away from starting an engine that had been rigged to kill him on the highway. The only thing standing between him and certain death was Timothy, a shivering 9-year-old homeless boy who threw his own small body in front of the front tire and screamed the warning that shocked everyone. When the biker looked down at what the boy was pointing at, his blood ran cold. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The wind off Lake Erie cut through the streets of Detroit like a rusty knife. It whistled through the cracked pavement of the industrial district, where the factories stood like skeletons of a forgotten age. In the shadows of a greasy spoon diner near the interstate sat Timothy. He was only 9 years old, but his eyes held the weariness of an old man who had seen too much winter. Most people walked right past him without a second glance because to them, he was just another stain on the sidewalk. They did not see the brilliance hiding behind his dirty face. Before we dive deeper into Timothy's story, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city and country in the comments right now, because this story belongs to every corner of the world. While other children his age were chasing soccer balls or playing video games, Timothy was lost in a world of mechanical rhythm. His mind did not work like theirs because he saw the world in patterns and vibrations rather than social cues. He could stand on the corner for hours just listening to the traffic on the highway. He did not hear noise. He heard a symphony of pistons and gears and combustion. He could tell you if a sedan needed a new timing belt just by the pitch of its idle. To the patrons of the diner, he looked like a lost child staring at nothing but inside his head. He was taking apart every vehicle that passed by. He was reassembling them in his mind with a precision that would baffle a trained engineer. Drang. Most prized possessions were not toys or gadgets, but a handful of rusted washers and bolts he had scavenged from the gutters. He kept them in the pocket of his oversized coat like diamonds. Every morning he would take them out and polish them with a scrap of rag until they gleamed under the weak Michigan sun. This ritual was his way of creating order in a chaotic life. Timothy believed that everything broken could be fixed if you just had the right part and enough patience. It was a philosophy that kept his heart pure, even as his stomach rumbled with hunger. He did not understand why people threw things away so easily. To him, a stripped screw was not garbage. It was just a piece of metal waiting for a new purpose and a second chance. This beautiful obsession with how things worked left him dangerously exposed to how people worked. Timothy possessed a fatal flaw in the jungle of the inner city, which was his absolute inability to understand deception. He assumed that humans operated like machines where inputs led to predictable and logical outputs. If you were nice to someone, they should be nice back. He could not comprehend the concept of cruelty for the sake of cruelty. This innocence made him a walking target for the predators who prowled the streets looking for weakness. He was a soft creature in a world of sharp edges. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death with a smile, because he was too busy admiring the mechanics of the street lamps to notice the darkness gathering around him. His home was a fortress of soggy cardboard boxes tucked behind the dumpster of the convenience store next to the diner. It was a miserable existence that smelled of stale grease and exhaust fumes, but Timothy tried to keep it tidy. He arranged his sleeping bag with geometric precision. His mother was gone now, taken by a sickness that the hospitals would not treat without insurance, leaving him to fend for himself. He waited for her to come back with the loyalty of a dog waiting by the door. The loneliness was a physical weight on his small shoulders. At night when the temperatures dropped, he would curl up and hum the sound of a V8 engine to soothe himself to sleep. It was the only lullaby he had ever known in this cold, concrete wasteland. The diner was a beacon of warmth and light that he was never allowed to enter. Through the foggy glass windows, he could see families eating pancakes and drinking hot coffee. The smell of frying bacon would drift out of the vents and torture his empty belly. He watched the patrons with wide, curious eyes, wondering what it felt like to sit in a booth and be served. Sometimes a waitress would look out and frown, shooing him away with a wave of her hand as if he were a stray cat. They did not see a hungry boy who needed a meal. They saw a nuisance that might scare away paying customers. The glass between him and the warmth was thin, but it might as well have been a wall of solid steel. It was not just the hunger that hurt him, but the casual cruelty of the streets. Local teenagers would sometimes pass by and kick his meticulously arranged collection of bolts just to see him scramble. They called him names he did not understand and laughed at his oversized clothes. When they shoved him into the mud, Timothy did not get angry or fight back. He would just sit there confused, calculating the trajectory of his fall and wondering why they wasted energy on destruction. His lack of reaction often bored them enough to make them leave. He would simply pick himself up, wipe off the dirt, and start organizing his treasures tires again. His resilience was not born of toughness, but of a complete dedication to his own internal logic that refused to acknowledge hate. To Timothy, the entire city of Detroit was just a giant engine that had been neglected for too long. He saw the rust on the bridges and the potholes in the roads as signs of poor maintenance rather than urban decay. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to monitor the health of his surroundings. If a car parked nearby had a leaking radiator, he would stare at the puddle of green fluid with genuine concern. He wanted to tell the drivers about their mechanical ailments, but he was too afraid to speak. He was a silent guardian of machinery in a place that let everything rot. His heart broke not for himself, but for the beautiful machines that were being treated with such disrespect by their careless owners. As the days grew shorter, the shadows around his cardboard sanctuary grew longer and darker. The bitter wind from the north was a warning that the real winter was coming to freeze the life out of the city. Timothy was becoming thinner, and his movements were slowing down from lack of nutrition. The vibrant spark in his eyes when he looked at an engine was the only thing keeping him alive. He was a tiny cog spinning alone in a massive, indifferent machine that was slowly grinding him down. The world was closing in on him, and there was nobody coming to save him. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and he did not even have a coat warm enough to survive the fall. Despite the cold and the hunger, Timothy took his post on his overturned milk crate that morning with renewed purpose. He sensed something in the air that day, something that vibrated at a different frequency than the usual hum of the city. He cleaned his favorite bolt one last time and placed it in his pocket for good luck. He scanned the horizon of the interstate, waiting for the next mechanical marvel to roll into the parking lot. He did not know that his life was about to collide with a force of nature that would change everything. He sat there small and shivering, a silent sentinel of the streets, unaware that he was about to become the most important person in the world. The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted violently when the massive black shape of a custom motorcycle tore into the lot. The sound of its engine was a deep baritone thunder that rattled the fillings of everyone inside the diner. This was not a weekend toy for a dentist, but a serious machine built for long, hard miles on the unforgiving interstate. The rider killed the ignition, and the sudden silence was heavier than the noise had been. He swung a heavy boot over the seat and stood up to his full height, which seemed to block out the gray sun. He was a mountain of a man, known on the streets only as Iron Jaw, and he carried an aura of danger that made the air around him feel thin and electric. Iron Jaw was the kind of man that mothers warned their children about in hushed tones. His face was a roadmap of scars and weather beating hidden behind a thick beard that reached his chest. His leather vest was faded and cracked from years of abuse, covered in patches that signified rank and loyalty to a brotherhood the civilians inside could never understand. His arms were thick as tree trunks and completely covered in ink that told stories of war and loss. He walked with a limp that hinted at old crashes and broken bones that had healed wrong. To the people eating their lunch, he was a walking nightmare of violence and chaos, but to Timothy, he was simply the pilot of the most beautiful machine on earth. The patrons inside the diner instinctively looked away as Iron Jaw approached the glass door. They focused intently on their coffee cups, terrified of making eye contact with the beast. This was the reaction he was used to receiving everywhere he went in the civilized world. Society saw the leather and the size and the scowl and assumed he was a criminal or a thug. They did not see the veteran who had served his country or the man who rode across states to raise money for sick children. They only saw a monster. Iron Jaw pushed the door open and the bell chimed a cheerful note that sounded ridiculous against his grim presence. He walked to the counter and ordered a black coffee, his voice like gravel grinding in a mixer, while the giant was inside fueling. Himself, the real monster, emerged from the shadows across the street. Slick Miller wiped his greasy hands on a rag and watched the diner with eyes that burned with petty malice. He hated the bikers because they represented a freedom he could never buy and a strength he could never fake. He saw the unattended motorcycle as a personal insult to his territory. He checked to make sure no one was watching and sprinted across the road in a crouch. He moved like a scavenger rat, darting between the parked cars until he reached the gleaming chrome beast. He pulled a pair of heavy pliers from his back pocket and grinned a smile that was missing several teeth. Miller went to work with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. He located the hydraulic brake line on the front wheel and squeezed the pliers until the reinforced rubber snapped. A small bead of brake fluid wept out onto the asphalt like blood from a wound. He did not stop there because he wanted to ensure a catastrophe. He reached down to the front axle and clamped onto the main nut that held the wheel in place. He wrenched it backward, loosening the torque until it was just finger-tight. At highway speeds, the vibration would work the nut free, and the front wheel would simply detach, sending the rider into a fatal tumble. Timothy watched this violation from his spot behind the dumpster with wide, horrified eyes. His autistic mind processed the scene not as a crime, but as a critical, mechanical error that had been introduced to the system. He saw the cut line and understood that hydraulic pressure would drop to zero. He saw the loose nut and calculated the centrifugal force that would expel it. It was a mathematical equation that ended in death. He trembled as he watched Miller slink back across the street, satisfied with his sabotage. The logic in Timothy's head was screaming an alarm. A machine was broken. A system was compromised. The order of the universe had been disrupted, and it had to be corrected before the engine started. The door of the diner opened again, and Ironjaw stepped out into the cold wind. He adjusted his leather gloves and zipped his vest higher against the chill. He walked toward his bike with the heavy, confident stride of a man who trusts his machine with his life. He had no idea that he was walking toward a coffin made of steel and rubber. Timothy stood up from his crate, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was terrified of the giant man. He was terrified of speaking to strangers, but the terror of letting a machine fail and a human die was greater than his social anxiety. He clenched his fists and took a deep breath that tasted of exhaust and fear. Ironjaw threw his leg over the saddle and settled his weight onto the bike. He reached for the ignition switch, his thumb hovering over the button that would wake the beast. The routine was automatic for him, ingrained by decades of riding. He kicked up the kickstand and the bike leaned upright. He was seconds away from engaging the transmission and rolling out onto the highway where the sabotage would kill him. Timothy burst from his hiding spot. He did not run with the grace of an athlete, but with the desperate flailing motion of a child who has never played tag. He scrambled over the curb and sprinted across the cracked pavement, his oversized boots slapping loudly against the ground. The biker heard the footsteps and turned his head, expecting a beggar or a thief. He saw a small, dirty blur rushing toward him, and his instinct was to defend his space. He scowled and prepared to shout at the street rat to get back. But Timothy did not ask for money. He did not ask for food. He threw his small body in front of the massive front tire, creating a human barrier between the machine and the road. He spread his arms wide in a crucifix pose, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked up at the bearded face that loomed above him like a thunderhead. Tears of fear were streaming down his dirty cheeks, but he did not move an inch. Ironjaw paused, his hand freezing on the handlebars. He was confused by the sheer audacity of the child. He looked down at the boy and saw the terror in his eyes, but also a fierce determination that made no sense. He was about to bark a command to move when Timothy found his voice. It was high and trembling, but it carried the absolute conviction of a technical expert. Timothy screamed the words he had rehearsed in his mind. "Do not turn on the engine. Do not ride this bike. You cannot ride it. It is broken." The giant stared at the boy, bewildered. In all his years on the road, no one had ever dared to stand in front of his bike and give him orders. The biker turned off the ignition, and the silence returned to the parking lot. He leaned forward, his leather jacket creaking ominously. He asked the boy what he was talking about in a voice that usually made grown men stutter. Timothy did not back down. He pointed, a shaking finger at the front wheel assembly. His knowledge of mechanics took over, and he spoke the language of the garage. "The bad man cut the red line. The fluid is leaking. The axle nut is loose. It has no torque. The vibration will shear the pin. You will fall. You will die." He delivered the diagnosis with the clinical precision of a master mechanic reciting a safety report. Ironjaw frowned and swung his leg back over the seat, planting his boots on the ground. He knelt down on the oily pavement, ignoring the pain in his bad knee. He looked closely at the brake line Timothy was pointing at. He saw the clean cut in the rubber and the slow drip of fluid pooling on the rim. His eyes widened. He reached for the axle nut and touched it with his gloved hand. It spun freely. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale beneath his tan. The boy was right. This was not a prank. This was a death trap set to trigger the moment he hit 50 miles per hour. A wave of cold fury washed over the biker, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sense of shock. He looked from the sabotaged wheel to the small, shivering boy standing in the wind. He realized how close he had come to being roadkill. He realized that this tiny creature who looked like he hadn't eaten in days had just saved his life. Ironjaw was a man who lived by a code of loyalty and debt. He understood the value of a life because he had seen so many end. He looked at Timothy, and for the first time, he really saw him. He didn't see a street rat. He saw a warrior in rags who had stepped into the line of fire to save a stranger. The biker stood up slowly, towering over the boy again. But this time, his posture was different. The threat was gone, replaced by a stunned reverence. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were surprisingly kind. He asked the boy his name. Timothy whispered his name, looking down at his shoes, expecting to be yelled at for touching the bike. Iron Jaw shook his head slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He tried to hand it to the boy, but Timothy recoiled. Timothy shook his head violently. He explained that he didn't want money. He just didn't want the machine to be hurt. He didn't want the man to break. This refusal of reward stunned Iron Jaw even more than the sabotage itself. In a world where everyone had a price and everyone wanted something, this child had acted out of pure, unadulterated goodness. It cracked the hard shell around the biker's heart. He realized that this boy possessed a nobility that most of the politicians and businessmen he knew could never hope to achieve. Iron Jaw looked at the diner where the people were still staring, and then back at the boy. He felt a sudden protective urge, fierce and overwhelming, rising in his chest. He was about to ask the boy who did this when a shout from across the street shattered the moment. Slick Miller had been watching from his garage door, expecting to see a crash. When he saw the biker inspect the wheel and the boy pointing, he knew his plan had unraveled. Panic turned into aggression. He decided to take control of the narrative before the biker could figure out who was responsible. He ran out of his shop screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed an accusatory finger at Timothy, claiming the boy was a vandal. He yelled that he had seen the kid messing with the bike and trying to steal parts. Miller was gambling that the biker's anger would be easily directed at the helpless child. He sprinted across the road, determined to silence the only witness to his crime. Slick Miller charged across the asphalt like a bull seeing red, his face twisted into a mask of faux outrage. He did not care about the truth or the safety of the child he was about to assault. He only cared about covering his own tracks and maintaining his dominance over the neighborhood. He pointed a grease-stained finger at Timothy and screamed accusations that echoed off the brick walls of the diner. He called the boy a thief and a vandal, claiming that he had been plagued by this little rat for months. Miller knew exactly how to manipulate the optics of the situation. He knew that a dirty homeless child had zero credibility against a local business owner. He turned the narrative upside down, instantly painting himself as the victim of a juvenile delinquent who was destroying property for fun. The mechanic lunged forward and grabbed Timothy by the collar of his oversized coat, lifting the small boy off his feet. Timothy did not fight back because his mind was paralyzed by the sudden influx of aggressive sensory data. He dropped his hands to his sides, and his precious collection of polished bolts spilled out of his pockets. They clattered onto the concrete like hail, a tragic sound of his small, ordered world falling apart. Miller shook him violently, screaming that he was going to teach him a lesson about touching other people's property. The physical contact was terrifying for Timothy, who experienced touch as a form of burning pain. He squeezed his eyes shut and retreated deep into his own mind, trying to calculate the structural failure of his own spirit. A siren wailed in the distance and grew rapidly louder, signaling the arrival of what should have been salvation. A Detroit Police Department cruiser screeched into the parking lot, its lights flashing blue and red against the gray sky. For a brief moment, a flicker of hope sparked in Timothy's chest, because he had been taught that police officers were the mechanics of society. They were the ones who fixed the broken rules and tightened the loose bolts of justice. He believed that once they saw the cut brake line and the loose axle, they would understand the logic of the situation. He naively thought that the uniform represented an objective truth that could not be swayed by loud voices or lies. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, looking tired and annoyed at having their patrol interrupted. Officer Jenkins was a heavy man with a mustache that did not hide his sneer, and he clearly knew Miller by name. They exchanged a nod that spoke volumes about the corrupt ecosystem of the neighborhood. Miller immediately launched into his fabricated story, gesturing wildly at the bike and the boy. He claimed that he had caught Timothy trying to strip parts off the motorcycle, and that he was just holding him for the law. The officers did not even look at the terrified child. They looked at Miller with the bored acceptance of men who had decided long ago that the path of least resistance was the only road to walk. Timothy tried to speak up, his voice trembling as he attempted to explain the technical details of the sabotage. He pointed at the caliper and used words like hydraulic pressure and torque specifications, trying to show them the physical evidence. But to Officer Jenkins, this was just the babbling of a disturbed street urchin. The cop laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that cut deeper than the wind. He told Timothy to shut his mouth before he added resisting arrest to his list of imaginary crimes. The system was not listening to the data, it was listening to the social hierarchy. In their eyes, Miller paid taxes and bought them donuts, while Timothy was just human refuse that needed to be swept into the gutter. Iron Jaw stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the two policemen. He tried to intervene, his voice rumbling with suppressed rage as he vouched for the boy's story. He pointed to the cut line and demanded that they inspect the evidence of attempted murder, but the officers turned on him with immediate hostility, their hands resting on their holsters. They saw the patch on his vest and the ink on his skin, and they made their judgment instantly. To them, he was a gang member and a troublemaker whose word was worth less than nothing. They told him to back off unless he wanted to have his bike impounded and spend the night in a cell. The system was profiling the hero and protecting the villain. The injustice of the moment was so thick, it felt like it was choking the air out of the parking lot. Miller smirked behind the officers' backs, a look of pure triumphant malice directed straight at Timothy. He knew he had won because the game was rigged in his favor from the start. The officers were not interested in justice. They were interested in maintaining order, and order meant keeping the homeless invisible and the business owners happy. They viewed Timothy not as a victim to be protected, but as a blight to be removed. The failure of the institution was absolute. It was a machine that had been designed to crush the weak and oil the gears of the powerful. Officer Jenkins grabbed Timothy by the arm with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into the bruise Miller had already left. He dragged the boy toward the edge of the lot, away from the diner and the bike. He leaned down and hissed a threat into Timothy's ear that shattered whatever innocence the boy had left. He told him that if he ever saw him near this shop again, he would lock him up in juvenile detention, where the big kids would eat him alive. It was a sanction of terror, delivered by the very person sworn to protect him. The police were essentially acting as Miller's private security force, enforcing his cruelty with the weight of the state behind them. The bystanders inside the diner watched the scene unfold through the glass and did absolutely nothing. They sipped their coffee and looked at their phones, relieved that the police were handling the problem. This was the silent complicity that allowed the system to fail so spectacularly. Good people did nothing because it was easier to believe that the dirty kid was guilty than to accept that the world was this unfair. Timothy looked at the window, seeking a single sympathetic face, but found only indifference. The isolation was complete. He was standing in a crowd of people, yet he was the loneliest soul on the planet. The social contract had been torn up and thrown in his face. The officer shoved Timothy toward the street, causing him to stumble and fall onto the gritty pavement. His hands scraped against the concrete, and he felt the sting of fresh blood on his palms. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological devastation of being discarded. He had tried to do the right thing. He had used his gift to save a life, and his reward was humiliation and violence. The logic of the universe had broken down completely. Inputs did not equal outputs. Goodness did not result in safety. Timothy curled into himself on the sidewalk, wishing he could just disappear into the cracks in the cement. Miller stood by the cruiser, laughing with the officers, making a joke about how the city needed better pest control. They chuckled along with him, validating his inhumanity. They ignored the cut brake line, which was clear physical evidence of a crime, because investigating it would require paperwork and effort. They chose willful ignorance over duty. They dismissed the sabotage as wear and tear or junky vandalism without even looking closely. It was laziness weaponized into evil. They were giving Miller a free pass to kill again because investigating him was too inconvenient for their lunch break. The banner of "To Protect and Serve" seemed like a cruel joke painted on the side of their car. Iron Jaw stood by his bike, his fists clenched so hard that the leather of his gloves creaked. He watched the police bully the boy and joke with the attempted murderer. A dark realization settled over him like a shroud. He had fought for his country, believing in freedom and justice, but here on the streets of Detroit, those words were empty husks. The law was not going to help Timothy. The law was the boot on Timothy's neck. If he called a lawyer or filed a complaint, it would take months, and by then, Miller would have hurt the kid again. The legal system was a dead end, a maze designed to trap the righteous and let the wicked roam free. The officers got back into their car, satisfied that they had restored the peace by crushing the weak. They drove away, leaving Miller standing tall and victorious on the curb. The mechanic looked at Timothy, who was still on the ground, and made a slashing motion across his throat. It was a silent promise that as soon as the biker left, he would finish what he started. Miller felt untouchable. He had the police in his pocket and the community under his thumb. He believed there were no consequences for his actions. He believed that power was the only thing that mattered, and he had all of it. Timothy sat up slowly, picking the gravel out of his bleeding hands. His eyes were dull and empty, the spark of intelligence extinguished by the trauma. He looked at his scattered bolts, the only things he loved, lying in the dirt like garbage. He didn't try to pick them up. What was the point of fixing things in a world that was fundamentally broken? He felt a deep existential cold that no coat could block. He was a malfunction in society's design, and they had just tried to delete him. He realized that he was small, and the world was big and cruel, and there was no place for a boy who heard music in engines. Iron Jaw looked at the defeated boy, and then at the arrogant smirk on on Miller's face. The biker's internal moral compass, which pointed true north, spun wildly and then locked into a new direction. He realized that playing by the rules was impossible when the referee was rigged. The failure of the system had created a vacuum of justice, and nature abhors a vacuum. If the police wouldn't protect the innocent, then someone else had to. If the courts wouldn't punish the guilty, then a different kind of court needed to convene. A court made of asphalt and iron, where the gavel was a sledgehammer. The giant biker walked over to Timothy and gently helped him stand up. He brushed the dirt off the boy's coat with a tenderness that belied his terrifying appearance. He didn't say a word about the police or the unfairness of it all because words were useless now. He looked deep into Timothy's eyes and made a silent vow. The system had declared that this boy was trash, but Ironjaw knew he was treasure. The system had failed, but the Brotherhood would not. The biker turned his back on the mechanic and walked to his saddlebags. He wasn't leaving. He was retrieving his phone. The atmosphere in the parking lot grew, heavy with a different kind of tension. It was the calm before a catastrophic storm. Ironjaw didn't dial 911. He dialed a number that didn't exist in any phone book. He was done asking for permission to exist. He was done asking for justice to be served. He was going to manufacture his own justice and deliver it wholesale. He looked at Miller one last time, a look of icy finality. The mechanic didn't know it yet, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had poked a sleeping bear, and he was about to find out that the bear brought the whole pack. Ironjaw held the phone to his ear and spoke 3 words that would change the destiny of everyone in that parking lot. His voice was low and flat, devoid of emotion, but terrifying in its implications. He simply said, "Bring them all." He hung up and crossed his arms, waiting. He stood like a sentinel between the boy and the world. The system had had its chance, and it had failed. Now it was time for the old laws. It was time for the thunder. The timeline for mercy had expired, and the timeline for retribution had just begun. The silence that hung over the parking lot was deceptive and heavy, like the humid air before a tornado touches down. Slick Miller stood by his garage door with his arms crossed, wearing a smile that was equal parts arrogance and stupidity. He believed he had won the day, because the police cruiser was driving away, and the homeless brat was bleeding in the dirt. He lit a cigarette with a shaky hand, trying to look casual, but his eyes kept darting toward Ironjaw. The giant biker had not moved a muscle since he made the call. He stood like a statue carved from granite, his back to the mechanic, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Ironjaw was checking his watch not out of impatience, but with the precision of a military commander coordinating a strike. He knew exactly how long it took for the thunder to roll in. The first sign that the world was about to end for Miller came from a puddle of oil near his feet. The dark liquid began to ripple in concentric circles, vibrating to a frequency that was too low for the human ear to hear. It was a subterranean tremor that traveled through the bedrock of the city, shaking the foundations of the diner. Inside the restaurant, the coffee and the cups began to dance, and the silverware rattled against the ceramic plates. The patrons looked around in confusion, thinking it might be an earthquake, but this was something far more man-made. It was the collective horsepower of hundreds of V-twin engines, synchronizing their combustion cycles into a single terrifying note. The ground itself was beginning to groan under the weight of the approaching storm. Then came the sound, a distant drone that sounded like a swarm of angry hornets grown to the size of fighter jets. It started as a hum on the interstate, but quickly swelled into a deafening roar that drowned out the city traffic. The wind seemed to pick up, carrying the scent of high-octane fuel and burning rubber directly into Miller's face. He dropped his cigarette and took a step back, his confidence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. He looked toward the off-ramp and saw the sun glinting off something that looked like a river of mercury flowing down the asphalt. It was a solid wall of chrome and steel, stretching as far as the eye could see, moving with a singular, deadly purpose toward his shop. The lead pack turned the corner into the industrial park, and the visual impact was enough to stop the hearts of everyone watching. These were not weekend hobbyists riding rented scooters. These were the 1%ers, the outlaws and the veterans who lived their lives on 2 wheels. They rode in a tight formation that required immense skill, their handlebars inches apart, creating a phalanx of iron. At the front rode the chapter president, a man whose beard was white with the dust of 1,000 miles, and whose eyes were hard as flint. Flanking him were the sergeants at arms, big men who looked like they could wrestle bears and win. They did not slow down as they approached. They accelerated, filling the air with a sonic boom that shattered the calm of the afternoon. The sheer scale of the arrival was impossible to comprehend for the terrified mechanic. It was not just 10 bikes or even 50. It was a tsunami of leather and denim that just kept coming and coming. There were patches from 3 different states representing a coalition of clubs that usually rivaled each other but united instantly for a call of distress. They flooded into the parking lot like a dark tide, swallowing occupying every inch of available space. They drove over the curbs and onto the grass and blocked the entire street in both directions. The traffic on the main road came to a complete halt as drivers abandoned their cars to film the spectacle. It was an invasion force occupying enemy territory with overwhelming numbers. The noise became a physical assault on the senses, a wall of sound that vibrated in the chest cavity and made teeth ache. It was the sound of absolute unbridled power. Slick Miller covered his ears and backed up until he hit the corrugated metal door of his shop. He looked for the police, but they were gone, leaving him to face the consequences of his cruelty alone. He realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that he was not the predator anymore. He was a very small rat trapped in a cage with 1,000 lions. The vibration was so intense that tools started falling off the shelves inside his garage, clattering to the floor as if poltergeists were tearing his business apart from the inside out. The patrons of the diner were pressed against the glass, their mouths hanging open in shock. They had never seen anything like this in their sheltered lives. They saw men with tattoos on their faces and scars on their arms riding machines that looked like medieval weapons of war. But amidst the terrifying imagery, they saw something else. They saw discipline. The bikers did not rampage or destroy. They parked with military precision, forming concentric circles around two figures in the center of the lot. At the eye of this hurricane stood Ironjaw and little Timothy. The boy looked around with wide eyes, not seeing monsters, but seeing the most magnificent collection of machines he had ever dreamed of. Officer Jenkins, who had just turned the corner to leave, saw the blockade in his rearview mirror and slammed on his brakes. He watched in horror as the street was consumed by the Brotherhood. He realized that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He had dismissed a call for help from a man who commanded an army. The police radio crackled with frantic calls from dispatch, asking about the traffic disturbance, but Jenkins was too stunned to answer. He knew that if he tried to intervene now, he would be swallowed whole. The balance of power had shifted violently. The badge on his chest felt very light compared to the thousands of patches that now surrounded the scene. The law of the streets had arrived to overrule him. The bikes kept pouring in, filling the side streets and the alleyways until the entire neighborhood was gridlocked with motorcycles. It was a sea of black leather and polished chrome, a visual representation of force that no single man could withstand. The riders killed their engines in waves, starting from the back and moving forward. The sound died down slowly, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the creaking of leather gear. When the last engine was cut, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of judgment. 800 pairs of eyes turned simultaneously to look at the mechanic, who was now trembling uncontrollably against his door. The diversity of the crowd was a testament to the universal code they lived by. There were grizzled Vietnam veterans with POW patches, young men on sport bikes who rode with the reckless abandon of youth, and gray-bearded grandfathers on touring rigs. There were black men and white men and Latino men, all wearing the same expression of grim determination. They were united by a single unbreakable rule: you do not touch a child, and you do not sabotage a bike. Miller had broken both. The tribalism of the biker world had dissolved into a singular entity of retribution. They were not individuals anymore. They were a single organism designed to protect the innocent and crush the wicked. Ironjaw walked over to the president and exchanged a handshake. That looked more like a collision of tectonic plates. He spoke a few words, pointing first to the boy and then to the brake line of his bike. The president nodded slowly, his face unreadable behind his sunglasses. He turned to the assembly and made a hand signal. Immediately, 50 men dismounted from their bikes. These were not just random riders, they were the mechanics and the enforcers. They walked toward the bike with tool rolls in their hands, acting as forensic experts for the court of the streets. They ignored Miller completely, treating him like a ghost that was about to be exorcised. They formed a protective wall around Timothy, a fortress of human bodies, 3 men deep. They stood with their backs to the boy, facing outward toward the world. It was a symbolic gesture that brought tears to the eyes of the waitress watching from the diner. For his entire life, Timothy had been invisible and vulnerable. Now he was the most protected human being in the city. The men nearest to him did not look at him with pity, but with respect. One of them reached down and picked up a bolt that Timothy had dropped, wiping it clean on his vest before handing it back. It was a small act of kindness performed in the shadow of immense violence. Miller watched the wall form and felt his bladder threaten to let go. He tried to stammer an excuse, but his throat was so dry try, he could only make croaking sounds. He looked for a weapon or a way out, but there was nowhere to run. The bikers had effectively created a prison of flesh and steel. The fear he felt was primal, the kind of terror a caveman feels when the fire goes out and the wolves circle. He realized that his money and his connections meant absolutely nothing here. These men did not care about his property value or his political contributions. They operated on a currency of honor, and he was bankrupt. The lead mechanic inspected the cut brake line and the loose axle nut. He stood up and held the severed rubber tube in the air for everyone to see. A low growl rippled through the crowd, a sound of collective disgust. It was the confirmation they needed. This was not an accident. It was a premeditated attempt to kill a brother. The evidence was irrefutable. The mechanic pointed a greasy finger at Miller and then gave a thumbs-down signal. The verdict had been delivered. The crowd shifted forward a single step that closed the noose tighter around the villain. The air was thick with the promise of consequences. The psychological pressure on Miller was worse than any physical beating. He was being dismantled piece by piece by the sheer weight of their presence. He fell to his knees, sobbing and begging for the police to come back. He confessed his crime in a hysterical babble, admitting that he cut the line and loosened the nut just to teach the biker a lesson. He screamed that he didn't mean to kill anyone, which was a lie that no one believed. His confession was recorded by 100 cell phones held up by the writers. He had just handed the authorities a perfect case wrapped in a bow of cowardice. Ironjaw stepped through the crowd, parting the sea of leather like Moses. He walked up to Miller, who was now curled in a fetal position on the oily concrete. The giant did not raise his fist. He did not kick the man. He simply loomed over him, blocking out the sun. He leaned down and whispered something that made Miller freeze. He told him that the police were coming back, but this time they wouldn't be able to ignore the truth. He told him that there were 800 witnesses who just saw him confess. The bikers weren't going to hurt him because he wasn't worth the jail time. They were going to ensure he lost everything else. If you believe power shouldn't protect predators, and that true justice sometimes requires a little horsepower, smash that like button right now. Your engagement proves to the algorithm that people care more about justice than politics. We need to show the world that when the system fails, the community must stand up. Don't just watch this story, be a part of the movement that demands accountability. Hit subscribe if you want to see more stories where the good guys actually win. Let's get this video to 1 million likes to show every bully out there that they are outnumbered. The police cruiser returned, creeping back into the lot with its lights flashing nervously. This time there were 4 other squad cars behind it, called in by the sheer magnitude of the gathering. Officer Jenkins stepped out, but his arrogance was gone. He saw the wall of bikers and the weeping mechanic, and the evidence being held up. He knew he had no choice. He couldn't sweep this under the rug with 1,000 eyes watching and recording. The mob had forced the hand of the law. The bikers parted silently to let the officers through a channel of judgment that the cops had to walk. They hauled Miller up from the ground and handcuffed him. The charge was no longer vandalism or a civil dispute. With the evidence preserved by the bikers and the public confession, it was attempted murder and child endangerment. As they shoved Miller into the back of the car, the crowd did not cheer. They simply revved their engines. It was a single unified roar of approval, a mechanical gavel slamming down to close the case. Miller looked out the window as he was driven away, seeing his empire of dirt, surrounded by the knights of the road. He was finished. Timothy stood in the center of it all, clutching his bolt. He looked up at Ironjaw and the hundreds of other men. For the first time in his life, the noise didn't bother him. The roar of the engines sounded like a choir. He saw the patterns in the formation and the logic in their loyalty. He realized that he wasn't a broken part that needed to be discarded. He was the spark plug that had started this engine. He reached out and touched the chrome fender of Ironjaw's bike. It was warm and solid. He looked at the giant man and smiled. The flood had come, and it had washed away the fear, leaving only solid ground beneath his feet. With the patrol cars fading into the distance, the heavy tension in the parking lot dissolved into a feeling of triumphant camaraderie. The threat had been neutralized, and the predator was caged, leaving the space open for celebration. The bikers did not disperse immediately, because their mission was only half finished. Justice had been served to the villain, but now mercy had to be shown to the victim. Ironjaw placed a massive hand on Timothy's shoulder, guiding him toward the entrance of the diner. The same waitress who had looked at him with disdain earlier now held the door open with trembling hands. She forced a smile that was a mix of fear and apology. The social hierarchy of the establishment had been completely inverted in the span of an hour. The boy who wasn't allowed to loiter was now the guest of honor, escorted by the new kings of the city. They sat Timothy down down in the best booth by the window, the one usually reserved for paying customers with clean clothes. Iron Jaw slid in opposite him, the leather of the seat groaning under his bulk. The rest of the bikers filled every other seat in the restaurant, and the overflow crowd stood outside leaning against the glass. The cook in the back was working faster than he ever had in his life, grilling burgers and frying potatoes to feed the army that had just occupied his workplace. Iron Jaw ordered for the boy, demanding the biggest cheeseburger on the menu with a side of onion rings and a chocolate milkshake. Timothy sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at the silverware. For the first time in his memory, he was inside the warmth looking out at the cold, instead of the other way around. When the food arrived, the smell was intoxicating enough to make Timothy dizzy with anticipation. He looked at Iron Jaw for permission, and the giant simply nodded, his eyes crinkling with a gentle smile. Timothy ate with the ravenous dignity of someone who knows the true value of a meal. He savored the warmth of the meat and the sweetness of the shake, closing his eyes as the calories flooded his depleted system. The bikers watched him with a protective satisfaction. To them, feeding the hungry was a sacred duty that ranked higher than any law written by politicians. They were rough men who had seen the ugly side of life, but watching a starving child eat his fill brought a softness to their hardened faces that no one else ever saw. After the meal was finished and the bill was paid with a stack of cash that left a generous tip, the president of the club walked into the diner. He signaled for Timothy to follow him back outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot that bathed the chrome motorcycles in fire. The entire assembly of 800 men stood at attention, creating a corridor of honor leading to the center of the lot. The silence returned, but this time it was a reverent silence like the hush inside a cathedral. Timothy walked down the aisle, his small boots scuffing the pavement, feeling like a knight returning from a crusade. He stopped in front of Iron Jaw's bike where the president was holding something black and heavy in his hands. The president knelt down, so he was eye level with the 9-year-old boy. He spoke in a voice that carried to the back of the crowd without shouting. He declared that loyalty was not about blood or patches, but about action. He said that Timothy had shown more courage in 10 seconds than most men show in a lifetime. He unfolded the object in his hands, revealing a custom leather vest cut down to fit a child's frame. On the back was the club's insignia fully embroidered in gold and red thread. It was not a toy or a costume. It was an official cut signifying full protection under the club's charter. The president slipped the vest over Timothy's shoulders and buttoned it up. It was slightly too big, but to Timothy it felt like a suit of armor. On the front of the vest over the heart was a patch that read, Guardian. It was a title earned in the face of danger, a badge of honor that commanded respect on any street in America. The bikers erupted into applause, not the polite clapping of a golf tournament, but a thunderous rhythmic cheering that shook the ground. They banged their fists on their gas tanks and whistled. Timothy touched the rough patch with his fingertips, feeling the texture of the embroidery. He looked up at the sea of bearded faces and realized he was no longer alone. The crushing weight of his isolation had been lifted. He was part of a tribe now, a vast extended family that spanned the continent. The little wrench had found his place in the great machine of humanity, but the bikers knew that a leather vest would not keep the winter out of a cardboard box. While the ceremony was happening, a helmet had been passed around the perimeter of the crowd. It started empty and returned, overflowing with crumpled bills of every denomination. Mechanics, lawyers, veterans, and factory workers had all emptied their wallets. The president handed the heavy helmet to Iron Jaw, who presented it to Timothy. There was enough money inside to pay for a warm apartment for a year and to get his mother the medical treatment she desperately needed. They weren't just giving him charity, they were giving him a foundation. They had already made calls to a local contractor to fix up a derelict house near the club's headquarters, ensuring that Timothy would have a permanent roof over his head. The support didn't stop at housing because the bikers saw the genius hiding behind the boy's poverty. One of the riders, who owned a large engineering firm in Detroit, stepped forward and offered a full scholarship for Timothy's future education. He had seen how the boy analyzed the mechanical failure and recognized a gifted mind that needed nurturing. They set up a trust fund that afternoon, ensuring that Timothy would trade his cardboard box for a classroom. The narrative of his life had been rewritten. He was no longer the autistic homeless kid who was a nuisance. He was the prodigy who saved a life and was destined to build great things. The bikers weren't just saving him from the cold, they were saving his potential for the world. The transformation of the neighborhood was immediate and permanent. With Miller in jail and his shop shuttered, the dark cloud over the street lifted. The diner became a regular stop for the club, ensuring a constant presence that deterred any future crime. The local bullies who used to kick Timothy's bolts saw him walking to school wearing his vest and crossed the street to avoid him. They knew that messing with Timothy meant answering to an army of 800 uncles who rode Harleys. He walked with his head held high, not out of arrogance, but out of a newfound sense of security. The fear that had defined his existence was replaced by the confidence of a boy who knows he is loved and watched over. The final image of that day burned itself into the memory of everyone present. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of purple and orange, Iron Jaw lifted Timothy onto the seat of his motorcycle. The boy gripped the handlebars, his small hands dwarfed by the controls. He looked at the instrument panel, his eyes scanning the gauges with delight. Iron Jaw sat behind him and started the engine. The vibration hummed through, the frame connecting the boy and the man and the machine. Timothy laughed, a pure sound of joy that rose above the rumble of the exhaust. He wasn't driving, but for that moment, he was the captain of his own destiny. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear stop you from doing what is right. Timothy was terrified when he ran into the street, but he ran anyway because his heart was bigger than his fear. He taught a group of hardened outlaws that heroes don't always look like warriors. Sometimes they look like starving children in oversized coats. The strongest people in the world are not the ones who can inflict pain, but the ones who are willing to take a hit to protect someone else. Strength is not about how much you can lift, but about who you lift up when they are down. That is the true definition of power. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes exist, and they are all around us. They don't always wear capes and fly through the sky. Sometimes they wear worn-out leather and ride on 2 wheels. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and tell us who your hero is. The world can be a dark and cold place, but as long as we look out for each other, there will always be enough light to see the road ahead. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption. Ride safe and keep your eyes on the road.